A 20-year-old girl vanished, shocking the entire Ohio neighborhood. Inside a suspect's barn, the authorities found disturbing evidence while conducting their search. Even if these results were depressing, none could have predicted the horrifying discovery that was waiting for them at the depths of a covert secret hatch. What is the secret door all about? Who killed Sierra, and for what reason? From bloody handlebars to damning surveillance footage, the evidence is stacking up against Jim. Stick with us till the end as we unveil the mystery behind the secret door that reveals killer's darkest secrets. The odd disappearance of Sierra Jogan. 20-year-old Sierra Jogan and her partner, Josh Kolasinski, went riding in rural Fulton County, west of Toledo, on July 19, 2016. Sierra lived in Metamora, Ohio, with her grandparents while attending the University of Toledo. When Sierra's mother, Sheila Vakulik, got to her parents' house later that evening, she saw something strange. Sierra's bedroom light wasn't on. Given her tight relationship with her family and her 4 siblings, Sierra would have informed them if she intended to spend the night away from home. At first, Sheila was a little worried, but when she heard from Josh at 10:30 p.m. that evening, her worries quickly became panic. Josh asked Sheila if Sierra was at home. When she replied that she wasn't, Josh informed Sheila that he had texted Sierra several times without getting a response. The disturbing findings, the results of their additional investigation, only made the police feel more afraid. Blood was on the handlebars of Sierra's bike when they discovered it a few rows into the cornfield. Her sunglasses and her bike were discovered together at a location that was only 0.5 miles from her house. They also discovered a screwdriver, a motorcycle helmet that looked to be coated in blood, and another set of sunglasses that did not belong to Sierra. The police expanded their search and talked to neighbors because they thought there was a chance Sierra had been kidnapped. The search for Sierra. But FBI agents offered to assist with the case, and they set up an interview with Josh right away. The helmet discovered on the kidnapping side suggests that Sierra was most likely accompanied by a motorcycle rider when she was abducted. However, there was also a chance that someone else with sinister motives was hiding nearby, and the two weren't alone that night. Josh's statement has been amply proven.
Motorcycle. Sierra being the strong person followed me though. I decided to stop and turn around. I remember exactly what I said.
And the FBI investigators are starting to question whether he was involved in his girlfriend's abduction. What do you think happened to her? Was she kidnapped by someone she knew? Before we unveil more of this dark secret, please subscribe to Unsolved Files, where we bring you true crimes and cases. Don't forget to like, share, and comment on this video. Josh informed them that Sierra had on headphones that evening, proving to them that the earbuds discovered next to her bike belonged to her. Investigators are still left with many unanswered questions about this theory, including who might have done this and what were their plans for Sierra. The first questioning of James Jim. Unfortunately, it appeared that this unfortunate run of luck would continue when some people happened upon James Jim Worley's large property. He told them that on the day Sierra vanished, he had gone out on his motorcycle, but they continued to stall, so he had to push it the majority of the way down the road. He drove for a long time that night, but he never saw Sierra or anyone who might wish to harm her. Additionally, he told the investigators that he spends all of his time at the house taking care of his ailing elderly mother. Before Jim said something that attracted the investigators' attention, it looked like the interview might fail. Jim appeared to have witnessed something that could have been helpful to the detectives, based on his account of having been at the abduction scene. Jim's account did contain one flaw, though.
This is probably her bike and somebody else's bike. There was a blue one and a charcoal gray one, light charcoal gray colored, and they weren't put on their kickstands, they were just laying there.
As he claimed to have seen 2 bicycles in the cornfield when the investigators had only discovered one. After Jim had left, did someone go back to the crime scene to retrieve their bike? Jim was strange and a little brash. There was no doubt about that. Even though he might not have seen much while riding his bike, he did provide the detective with some intriguing information that could help them locate the abductor. After that, the detectives get ready to go on to the next house for more interrogation. So far, Jim's interview has been cordial, but as he tells investigators more, they start to wonder if there could be more going on. Jim remained friendly with the investigators, who were doing a great job of getting to know him. The reason for this is that they are attempting to maintain his composure so that he will continue talking, regardless of what he says. And it was a successful technique. Although they haven't made any indication that Jim is a suspect, investigators became suspicious when they learned that Jim had made a brief visit to the suspected abduction spot, and that some objects discovered there that didn't belong to Sierra belonged to him. Jim became irritated and suspicious because the detectives had been around him for such a long time. Jim seemed to have suddenly become aggressive, This excessive paranoia was probably starting to raise suspicions among the investigators. If he had nothing to do with the crime, why would Jim believe that the police were specifically pursuing him for it? Had his fingerprints been discovered on Sierra's bike? Jim hasn't done anything to warrant an arrest or a search of his home, despite some strange things he stated. Jim is adamant about allowing the investigators to search his home to clear his name, even though they had tried to leave so they could resume their questioning. Jim's convincing statement: this is essentially an attempt to maintain his innocence. He probably thinks that if he agrees to these searches willingly and quickly, they might not carry out the searches because he isn't acting suspiciously by refusing them. It seems as though he is following a script to appear innocent and is checking off requirements to get them to go on permanently. Jim insisted that the property be thoroughly checked, but the detectives left and went on, interrogating the occupants of other neighboring residences. The second questioning of Jim. But as the evidence from the alleged kidnapping scene was examined, alarming details emerged that compelled detectives to return to Jim's home a few hours later for additional interrogation. Jim appears to just believe that the investigators are either lying to him or are incorrect. He has refuted everything they have told him. There was also a long pause before he spoke. Then the letter, Compared to what they had heard from him previously, cadence had changed. Jim wasn't only trying to play the victim here, he was also gathering information. He doesn't want to be found out in a lie, but he also doesn't want to acknowledge anything to them that they don't already know. Jim appears unusually protective and has an excessive marijuana growing habit, which makes the detectives think he might be concealing something darker from them. Is it possible that as they talk with Jim in his engine repair shop, Sierra might be somewhere else on the property, captive and scared for her life? Similar to their previous interrogation, Jim offers to let the investigators search his property, and they accept his offer this time. When investigators approached his barn, they saw something off. Even though his house and shop appeared regular, there was a diaper-filled hole. He doesn't respond to their inquiry after asking it again to allow himself more time to consider the purpose of the diapers. Because of this, he was spared from having to tell lies about how he had been utilizing them. Regretfully, flies were discovered in that specific place. The possibility that something or someone died here could account for the flies, which is probably raising red flags for the investigators. Two of the investigators wander off as Jim is chatting with them about his Jeep and point out a scary spot in the back of the barn that Jim hasn't shown them. To put it mildly, they were shocked and somewhat unnerved by what they found. Although Jim's possession of knicker bags in his barn is legal, it is undoubtedly strange. If this seems unusual, Jim's reasoning was much more bizarre. Once more, the detectives do a great job of maintaining his composure and coming across as understanding to get him to continue speaking with them. Nevertheless, Jim's justification for the lingerie bags appears tenuous at best. It seems improbable that he is going out with people frequently enough to account for the large quantity of bags discovered, and it is strange to keep those bags in a dusty box in a barn. And Jim suddenly looks afraid of someone looking where they shouldn't be, and this fear is going to lead him to make a big mistake, considering how adamant he was only hours before about letting the investigator check his property. Jim had previously stated that he had only served time in prison for drug offenses. The investigators took note of Jim's unusual word choice and are now keeping a close eye out for any additional potential errors. Jim was sharing some hypotheticals with the police without their request, which I found to be interesting. He seems to be attempting to make his denials known before they have posed the questions. Investigators are trying to find a different technique to pull information out of Jim because he is becoming more and more defensive with every question. Jim is adamantly against taking a polygraph, citing a reading he did that stated there is disagreement over the validity of polygraphs and that they are inaccurate 2/3 of the time. Even though Jim is hesitant to answer a polygraph, the investigators have another trick up their sleeves. Two of the investigators move off to have a private talk, while one of them handles gathering Jim's DNA. Jim was eventually informed that the search warrant had been executed after having his DNA sampled and his fingerprints collected. As Jim is being provided with a copy of the search warrant, an investigator is summoned to examine the alarming discoveries made by the CSI team. The investigators deliberated on the blood discovered on the headwear, as well as other artifacts that matched Jim's DNA, in contrast to the typical course of action for an innocent person, who would presume it is their blood or be certain in their conviction that the blood is Sierra's. He begins to interrogate the officers ceaselessly in an attempt to obtain additional information or an explanation. Thus, he would be able to better tailor his story to the evidence. Although he eventually concludes that it must be his, that was not his initial thought. Jim continues to vehemently reject the evidence that the investigators have found. Other teams were working to recover evidence wherever they could, including surveillance camera footage from the abduction area, while Jim's residence was being searched. Although Jim claimed to have simply embarked on a solitary motorbike excursion that evening, the cameras captured an entirely different scene. Jim's maniacal mirth appears contrived. He may be attempting to appear indifferent, so the investigators cannot determine whether they are getting closer to apprehending him or whether he is joking. If this truck footage proves to be authentic, Jim's story could be on the verge of collapsing. You notice how easily and readily he devises a change to a story that does not render his narrative false, but does fit the evidence he believes they possess. At this point, he found himself ensnared in the liar's loop, attempting to modify his story in light of new information and inconsistencies. Jim should have refrained from telling the investigators the truth if he wished to avoid appearing suspicious. Not only does he appear to be concealing something, but the investigators' last vestige of confidence in him was almost certainly shattered. What investigators have just discovered in his barn, however, may cause him to react in an unexpected way if he currently considers the evidence against him to be weak. A secret concealed freezer is a highly suspicious discovery during a kidnapping investigation, as investigators have pointed out, and Jim's explanation is simply not sufficient. His response was an exclusion qualifier, which differs significantly from a definitive answer in that it allows the possibility that he was deliberately concealing information. What motivated Jim to bury a freezer in his barn? That is truly odd. However, Jim may be attempting to appear naive by withholding information about the freezer. The investigators will not be duped. Not only did Jim refrain from disclosing the existence of his dubious freezer to them, but he explicitly denied the existence of any concealed compartments within the barn. Already dubious, the existence of Jim's covert subterranean freezer became even more alarming as further inquiries were conducted in its vicinity. A cadaver dog detected an ammonia odor in the freezer, which suggested that a human body may have been stored there for an extended period. It is unquestionably suspicious, as an innocent individual would probably not tolerate that for long and would quickly become frustrated. Nevertheless, Jim appears to be inquisitive about the situation, so he cooperates with the various strategies to maintain communication with the investigators. The suspicion that Jim was involved in Sierra's disappearance is growing stronger, despite his insistence to the authorities. Subsequently, the investigators employed a common strategy. They made light of the crime by presenting alternative hypotheses. This serves as further evidence of the investigators' exceptional proficiency. Although they do not appear to adhere to the Reed technique line by line, it is evident that they possess sufficient familiarity with the process to effortlessly integrate the necessary skills into their conversation with him. Here, Jim has the potential to make yet another error. Investigator knowledge regarding the events that transpired at the location of Sierra's abduction was extremely limited. If Jim is sincere about his innocence, he ought to have an even smaller amount of knowledge than they do. The fact that he commented on Sierra having such an accident suggests that he is privy to the details, whereas he may have simply made a mistake. Almost certainly, investigators are mentally noting this questionable remark. Although distressing revelations have been made thus far, investigators maintain a glimmer of hope that Sierra may still be located before the conclusion of the investigation. On the contrary, Jim's account was deteriorating at the crime scene, and although the investigators may have been amicable with him earlier when he was babbling drivel, that is not the case at this moment. It is illogical for him to spray his barn with bleach out of the blue, particularly considering that he was attempting to eliminate insects. However, it is logical to assume that he would sanitize his barn if a recent demise had occurred there. An additional finding was made, resembling blood-soaked pinky trousers, which he refused. Jim deflects once more. His response does not explain the bloodied panties. Rather, he attempts to shock the detectives and divert their attention away from the subject. It is dubious that Jim waited until now to mention his desire to establish an erotic entertainment studio, even if he is indeed being truthful about it. Furthermore, he has yet to offer a rationale regarding the presence of blood on the undergarments. The investigators accepted Jim's offer to examine his computer records, and the contents they discovered profoundly disturbed them. The user recently conducted a search using the following terms: hitchhiker, hogtied, blindfold, and helpless. When these terms are combined with the evidence discovered in the barn, an ominous picture begins to emerge. Additional evidence against Jim is being uncovered in the vicinity of the barn during the search of his vehicles. While Jim had concluded his discussion regarding the case, he remained open to investigators discussing other aspects of his life. Jim insisted, despite engaging in several hours of conversation with investigators, that he was innocent and being duped. At approximately 1 a.m., the search of his residence commenced to wind down, and it was ultimately determined that the motorbike belonged to a woman. The discovery of blood in the concealed freezer further strengthened the investigators' suspicions. Without their knowledge, this marked the inception of the abhorrent revelations that lay ahead. However, the truth of the matter was evident to them, and one FBI supervisor even expressed his theory in Jim's presence. With an overwhelming body of evidence conspiring against them, it came as no surprise when Jim was apprehended shortly thereafter, on suspicion of Sierra's abduction. The processing of the evidence continued after Jim was arrested, and it appeared that the unsettling revelations would continue indefinitely. More discoveries unfolded. Both the mattress and the blood-stained undergarments that were discovered in the makeshift hay bale room and DNA tested matched Sierra. In Jim's truck were also discovered hair filaments, zip ties, dried blood, duct tape, a ski mask, and pepper spray. Even though the authorities were prepared to proceed with Jim's prosecution, in the absence of a body, Sierra was discovered shortly thereafter. After several hours had passed since Jim's arrest, a search team discovered the remains of Sierra, which had been only partially entombed in a field located a few miles away from Jim's property. Although the discovery itself was discouraging, the condition of Sierra's body truly turned the stomachs of the investigators. Her legs and limbs were bound behind her back, and based on the information gathered, she appeared to have an object lodged in her mouth. She was dressed in an adult diaper and a lacy, wide textile top at the time of her passing. It was discovered that the white cloth top was virtually identical to others discovered in Jim's lingerie luggage. The gig in Sierra's mouth was also identified as a gag, which bore a striking resemblance to additional BDSM items discovered on Jim's premises. Despite Sierra having visible wounds, like a laceration on her forehead and a contusion on her leg, asphyxiation due to the excessively large muzzle was the cause of her death. Sierra's loved ones endured unfathomable anguish upon the discovery of her remains, but it sealed the case against Jim, and investigators were certain he would be held accountable for his atrocities. What made Jim feel so ready for this abduction? Although his detention was the result of numerous errors, he appeared to have some understanding of the situation. It was quickly realized during that horrific moment that Jim's extreme preparedness had been predicated on the fact that this was not his initial abduction. Jim's trail. In March 2018, the formal trial of Jim commenced, and he was promptly convicted of several charges, including felonious assault, abduction, tampering with evidence, aggravated murder, and abuse of a corpse. Jim received the death penalty in judgment for his offenses. Jim has occupied himself while being held on death row. Surprisingly, he composed a 105-page manifesto in which he claimed the police were conspiring against him. The meticulousness and eerie nature of Jim's handwriting have been remarked upon by those who have seen the manifesto. His execution is scheduled for May 20th, 2025. While Sierra's family expressed their elation that her assailant was brought to justice, they contended that had law enforcement been aware of the presence of a violent offender in the vicinity, her death could have been completely averted. Ohio legislators were urged to establish a registry of violent offenders via a petition. The petition garnered more than 13,000 signatures, and by December 2018, Sierra's law, a legislative measure, had been enacted. Even though the legislation resulted in the loss of a valuable life, Sierra's mother expressed her optimism that it could inspire something positive to emerge from the tragic demise of her daughter. It was indeed a therapeutic experience. What do you think is the ideal punishment for James Jim? Let us know in the comment section below. You can also go check out this video on your screen of how a medical doctor commits horrific crimes with his scalpel. The sinister story of a doctor turned murderer. What are you waiting for? Go watch it now.